Now, the Food Marketing Institute recently projected that 20% of grocery shopping is going to take place online by 2025. That's upwards of $100 billion. So how do we use this to our advantage as a cohort of beverage entrepreneurs? What are the key channels and strategies? Where are the opportunities? Over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to have 3 different e-commerce pure plays auditioning for your understanding. But from the product side, the supplier side, we wanted to give a look at the playing field and the rules of the game for suppliers. To do that, we have Arnolfo Ventura, who's pioneering the e-commerce strategy for Calafia Farms, and Keith Anderson of Profitero, a company that sets performance metrics and programs for e-commerce partnerships. So we're going to sit down, we're going to talk to them, but first let's welcome them. Can you give us really quickly the big picture of the e-commerce space, where it is, where it's headed?
Yeah. I mean, you just heard the stat. The remarkable thing about beverage online and grocery overall, it still only represents about 2% of all sales. But depending on whose data you trust, it's accounting for anywhere from half to all of the growth. And I think it's being driven by a handful of trends. Most of us think of e-commerce as a single model, but there are at least 4 or 5 important models to appreciate. You've heard about Peapod and Fresh Direct and other local full basket, as we call them, players that offer local delivery or click and collect. Some of the big incumbent retailers like Kroger and Walmart have leapt off the sidelines and are expanding their services. You also have, of course, Amazon with its core .com national ship model and the emergence of Pantry, which is a little more economically sustainable for consumables categories. They're also leaping into the full basket game with Fresh and expanding. And then I think some barriers to entry have really fallen for the direct-to-consumer model. So you have a lot of emerging brands that are originating online. Some in beverage, some outside of beverage, but as a pathway to national visibility, it's really emerged as a critical channel.
Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by full basket?
Yeah, I think if you think about Amazon.com, the average order is 1 or 2 items. They're all shelf stable, but full basket is sort of the online equivalent of a typical grocery shop. Average order is $100 plus, 20, 30 items plus, and it includes temperature-sensitive products with a cold chain.
Okay. And we have a representative of one of those temperature-sensitive products here in Arnold Ventura. How does Calafia see the opportunity? What are the problems you're trying to solve, and what's unique about the strategy that your company's put into place?
Yeah, so I think in terms of how we think about e-commerce is that, well, first and foremost, we don't think of it as a channel, but as an entirely different marketplace.
Swing this forward a little bit.
I'm sorry. Oh. Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah, so we see it as a different marketplace altogether. And that's a big part of it. So in terms of how we set up the investment and how we view the space and execute altogether. In terms of how we're doing it differently, so one, as you mentioned, about 90% of our SKUs are perishable, require cold chain, value, supply chain infrastructure. So that's a challenge in itself, but in terms of how we're doing it differently, a big part of the company's mission is revolved around sustainability. So it's quite easy for us to send out a pack that goes out in styrofoam and to do that in a very creative way in terms of profitability. But the challenge is, how do you go about doing that business, have it be at parity with the rest of your brick and mortar profitability, and still do it in a way that's environmentally sustainable. So as it relates to secondary packaging, that's a whole different solve altogether, and the value chain that comes with the execution of that. So that's separate. That's more related to direct-to-consumer business, but it does get kind of blended as we think about the rise of marketplaces. on Amazon Jet and others, where there's a potential to do drop ship out of, same fulfillment centers. And then execution with the pure plays is another ball of wax.
Well, that's kind of an amazing third guideline that you guys have to think about as part of this. And it comes down to the question of, are you gauging environmental impact against a car trip, or are you gauging it against standard shipping?
So I'm not quite sure how to answer that. What I would say is that we're in the beginning phases of a life cycle analysis with regards to different parts of everything related to .com and fulfillment. And so we've looked at a preliminary review of our kind of current operations, and then not being content with our current solutions and trying to always think about how can we get better. We have certain things that have come through that are underway, that are looking positive, that are continuing to be improvements. So the unboxing experience for us is one that we have yet to even touch. I think in terms of getting the capability up and running, 15 months ago, it was about being, first and being early, and less so about being kind of perfect off the jump. So lots of improvement there for us. We feel good about how we went to market with regards to secondary packaging, but I think there's still a lot of runway ahead of us.
So not to get sidetracked on that,
Yeah.
what are the kinds of, what are the kinds of questions that our entrepreneurs here should be asking our presenting e-commerce retailers?
So all that presupposes they've decided that they're going to dive in. And I think a lot of companies, less among the emerging brand cohort, but a lot of companies are stuck at grappling with, is this incremental? Is all going to be profitable, incremental? And I think the reality is, as most of us can see at this point, is it's happening whether or not you're there. And if you don't participate, there are emerging players that are going to fill that space. So you've got to get in.
This is the argument that if I may be concerned that I'm going to cannibalize my own sale as a brand if I'm selling online, I may be sucking my sales out of the supermarket channel. But if I don't, someone else is going to suck it out of the supermarket channel anyway, and they're going to go online.
Yeah, and so you may decide you don't want to accelerate it, but you really don't have the choice of being totally absent. And then I think you have to understand both the demand chain and the supply chain for each of your retailers. So how are they attracting people to their site? What are the opportunities for you as a brand to support the demand chain, helping people discover or find your products, evaluate, decide to buy? A lot of that comes down to content, things like images, titles, descriptions. The more you can reflect positively on your products and on your brand, the more the people that see them are likely to buy them. And there's a huge emphasis online on discoverability and findability. So people have been trained at this point to search when they go to an online grocer or Amazon. And in many ways, it favors emerging brands. The more limited your national brick and mortar distribution is, the likelier people that already know your brand and want to find it are going to go to one of these online players looking for it. They've essentially been trained to do that. So you've got to make sure that you're discoverable there. And then on the supply chain, you want to understand, how are their orders fulfilled? If it's a national ship model, you heard Arnold mention primary and secondary packaging. It's usually not ground freight for these national ship players. So you've got to drop test your product to minimize leakage. You've got to rethink the unit economics to make sure that you're able to offset the cost of shipping and handling. Some brands have even innovated all the way down to the new product development level, rethinking product form in addition to packaging. So
that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the brands in terms of putting e-commerce closer to the inception of the innovation process. Yeah. Starting to think with e-commerce in mind as you think about your primary packaging. So when you go to do e-commerce later, you don't have the waste in terms of COGS of having to repack or do a frustration-free packaging because you didn't think about e-commerce in the beginning. Getting back to incrementality, just to kind of make the point, and Keith, I'd be interested to hear what you've seen, but I mean, studies that I've seen, whether it be globally or domestically, it's kind of the first question that we try to answer. Is this indeed incremental or cannibalistic? Everything in the way that I've seen, it seems that it's incremental, probably in the single-digit percentages-wise. So that's a data point that I've seen.
And if you've got expandable consumption, which in beverage you certainly do, there's all kinds of things you can do to drive incrementality. You can trade people to bigger pack sizes. You can put them on an auto replenishment plan so they have more supply in the home or the point of consumption. I think one of the big challenges that the industry needs a lot of focus on is a lot of beverage consumption in the brick and mortar landscape is for immediate consumption. And so there certainly are some new models like Prime Now that are close to on-demand delivery, but there's a lot of energy going into how do we replicate some of those impulsive or prompted purchases that happen in brick and mortar online so that we don't just lose that volume.
I mean, and getting back to the question too, Jeff, is that in terms of what should entrepreneurs be asking retailers, I don't think there's like one silver bullet. I think every platform is different. And what might work for one brand, even in the same category, doesn't necessarily gain resonance for a competitor or challenger brand in the same category, or an incumbent in the same category. So it's different in terms of what entrepreneurs should be asking. That's exactly it. They should be listening and asking, the account or the pure plays what really gains resonance on their platform.
We had about a minute ago, Keith sort of outlined a range of what I'd call defensive stances against sort of cannibalistic loss, and sort of more forward stances, more offensive stances toward getting that product to getting that channel to the core of the product. How are you guys walking that line?
Well, personally, I'm a passionate person, so I think I tend to lean more towards offense. In terms of my reference point, I think about what's the size of the prize, and that's kind of where our project got started. Call it 15 months ago, in terms of outlining exactly how big the dairy industry was, how much of that was happening online, what about alternative dairy, looking at ready-to-drink coffee, and so we kind of answered those numbers. And then within our competitive set, who are we ultimately sourcing share from? And how can we go about gaining a disproportionate amount of market share in a world that's quickly moving online? So I think for us, that's been the focus. I think for entrepreneurs, I think there's a shift. I think before it was, and it's interesting that we had Matt up here from Whole Foods right before us. Is that I think there's, in terms of how we go about gaining incubation, because we're in the same boat. In terms of trying to drive trial and awareness, how we go about doing that, I think is shifting. I think before, in terms of it was about getting distribution in one or two Whole Foods, trying to turn on the whole region, get to national, get across the board, or maybe even the co-ops before that. And now I think if you're starting a new brand today, first thing that needs to go up is your website, and you have to ask yourself the question: are we doing direct to consumer? Is it shoppable? What's going to be our platform? And then what about Amazon? I think if you can get smart in terms of, there's people today that are creating multi-million-dollar businesses just by looking at long-tail keywords on Amazon. So instead of creating a product and trying to optimize the platform to your product, they're looking at they're mining the keywords for where are people trying to search, and if there's a void, how do you go about meeting that pain point? So,
but the important thing is to think of it as channel strategy.
Well, channel strategy and transcending the distribution channel. I mean, when you hear a focus on awareness and trial, one of the often overlooked facets of Amazon specifically, but e-commerce broadly, has huge disproportionate influence over decisions people make, even if they don't ultimately buy online. A lot of people are discovering and researching and considering products, and there's no form of digital media or social media that has more detail and influential types of information, consumer-sourced information like ratings and reviews, that people use increasingly to decide, am I going to put this in my body? So you, of course, have to measure what's the current size of the prize. I would argue a disproportionate investment today can yield significant volume growth as the channel continues to outpace the market by 3 to 5x. But you also have to consider how influential it is over decisions people are making in the aisle.
Let's talk influencers. How do they play into this cycle that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, again, if you look at the pattern of people searching for products, more searches for products specifically originate on Amazon than Google. So if you're not ranking favorably on the first page of those results, you're not going to be in the consideration set. And then secondly, everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. You know, some people are willing to try a new product just based on the packaging, but some people aren't. And if they want to know, well, what do other people think of this product, they pull their phone out and they go check reviews on Amazon. So it's incredibly influential to decisions happening in every environment, you know, at home, on the go, in the store.
I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I need to. I want to move it past the Amazon influence to this class of influencers out there. And I think, you know, one point we can make is that Amazon is a powerful influencer. How do these hired guns kind of fit into the strategy?
You mean in terms of influencers that are promoting the brand?
Yeah.
Or, so I think at the end of the day, it has to be really authentic. If it's just, I think so in e-commerce, there's black hat, gray hat, white hat. And so that refers to, way back in the day on Amazon, you could actually hire vendors to basically pump you up with reviews and you'd get to the top of it. That's since been banned by Amazon. And if you do that today, you're actually banned from life. So,
From life?
Yeah, well, people pop up in their new like subsidiary or whatever it might be. So I think at the end of the day, it has to be authentic. It has to be transparent, traceable. What I'm finding is that brands are trying to find ways to link it together, though. So then, in other words, if you're leaving a review on Amazon, can our customer service desk back in LA reply directly on the platform? And whether it's happening on other platforms too. I think, and just to kind of back up to your point, I mean, the world is much bigger than Amazon in terms of also how we even began in looking at e-commerce as a space we wanted to develop is more with like a global view. So, you know, we can't forget about the UK being the most mature e-commerce market and what learnings are happening there in terms of like queues forming around corner blocks for click and collect services. And then in China, you have the largest e-commerce market altogether. I mean, their Singles Day dwarfs our Cyber Monday and Black Friday. So it's in terms of how the engagement's happening with the consumer. China, for example, it's almost every brand gets the obligatory WeChat inquiry from a consumer before a purchase is even made. So and just think about that, and then now let's come back to the States.
That sounds super annoying. What? Just speaking as a consumer, where do you guys expect these international phenomena to? Which of these international phenomena do you expect will find most purchase here? Is it that click and collect model that you're talking about, or the walkout model that we've seen in Seattle?
I have my hypothesis. I'd love to hear Keith's.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of interest and viability for delivery and for click and collect, usually in a different context. I think in the largest, highest density urban metros, the preference based on the data is for delivery. You tend to have households that can afford it and value the convenience. But in a lot of less densely populated catchment areas, it's not economically sustainable to deliver to everybody, and the people won't pay for it. So click and collect is a really compelling way, if you run a network of physical stores, to leverage your existing asset base. And if you don't, as you see Amazon and others starting to experiment with, it can be a way to compromise with the shopper, and you'll still pick and pack the order and stage it for pickup, but it's ultimately their labor and their fuel getting that order back to their house.
And I agree with that. I think at the same time, for retailers, we don't know. I mean, retailers don't know yet. They're still experimenting, right? So how many times have you been to a Target store and seen the shelves look relatively picked over compared to what you're used to seeing? And that's because they're running fulfillment out of their stores. And, you know, last week, Walmart unveiled their huge vending machine that's a click and collect center. You have Amazon doing drive-through. So it's, or taking out the friction from an in-store.
Do you think store-based fulfillment is going to be sustainable? Did I just say that? What has happened to me?
Yeah.
I was an English major. Is store-based fulfillment going to be successful?
I think that question falls on, it's a real estate game and who has the most square footage to operate with. And I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, I think actually of the retailers, I think Macy's is number one. That's changing, but their strategy could be changing as well. I think number two is Walmart. Number three is Target.
I think there are good lessons to be learned from the UK, where that model has matured a lot faster than here. And I think up to a certain volume threshold, 10 or 15% of a store's volume, it can be sustainable. But at that point, you've got issues with out of stock. In a typical store configured for consumers, you simply can't keep enough inventory on hand to serve both an in-store and an online consumer. And the more uniformed employees you have battling shoppers in the aisle, the less desirable it gets. So in the UK, they introduced dark stores, which are stores that were either originally operating open to consumers or were zoned for it, and they're closed down to consumers. And you can reconfigure the layout of that space, optimize it for online order fulfillment, which is very different than a typical store.
Yeah.
And so you might close one store in an area and leave the rest open and fulfill all of the orders out of that single store.
Let's bring it back to the supplier, though, because as fascinating as this is about how these brands play in that market.
Yeah.
So in addition to supporting your sort of pure play strategy as an emerging brand, what's more important, that or that direct-to-consumer model?
I mean, the pure play versus the direct-to-consumer model?
Yeah.
I think, I think it's an and statement.
Okay.
It's tangentially pursuing the two. In terms of where you had to, if you had to dedicate resources in the way of your own time, energy, or people, at this stage of the game, it's about driving that top line number while being cognizant of the bottom line, and you got to think about where is that going to come from. And so it's not necessarily the biggest platform, i.e. an Alibaba, i.e. an Amazon, but maybe a platform where your brand has a consumer base that's going to gain, has a consumer that's going to gain resonance with your brand. So
yeah, you've got to define success and set your objectives, and they play very different but important roles. Your own direct-to-consumer channel is a way to deepen the connection with your most loyal shoppers. There are people that love your brand and want all of your products in one place. They want to know the history. They want to know more than you can typically present in a standard retail environment. But Tide.com gets 1/10 of the traffic in a year that Amazon gets in a month. And so if your number one objective is visibility and volume growth, you're going to want to prioritize the channels that have the existing eyeballs.
I think for a brand,
Yep.
DTC is a consumer touch point. But I think for the entrepreneur behind the brand, there's also this valuation argument too, right? So I think I mentioned this to you before.
Yeah, no, and this is the last question that I want to bring up, which is what this leads us to is this different set of metrics for success. And so when you're talking to investors and other stakeholders, what is the new language that you're talking, and what are the new metrics? Because that may be what ultimately guides how you're reconfiguring your business to fit this new retailing model.
Yeah, so I think, for most D2C businesses, we aren't so dissimilar. We look at dollar per visit. We look at average order value. We look at conversion ratio for the D2C side of the business. In terms of, those are probably the core KPIs. We have a bunch of others.
You look at registered accounts or active shoppers?
Subscription. I look at subscription too. So being that, how many of us have an Amazon business with a big subscribe and save element to it? I think subscribe and save is an interesting, it's an interesting model altogether, and so a lot of area to gain traction there. But in terms of KPIs that I'm hearing about, like in the hallways here even, right? So we were talking about cost of acquisition. So all of a sudden through D2C, you're able to get some metrics on cost of acquisition that you wouldn't normally be able to get as clearly as brick and mortar. So that's an interesting one. I think lifetime value of the customer. So for some entrepreneurs, an exit is indeed the immediate path. And I hear more and more kind of folks wanting to be able to prop up the business that they have in D2C and show the lifetime value of that customer and anchor a valuation conversation, not so much in a traditional food and beverage kind of multiple, but more so in maybe a more tech adjacent kind of multiple. And I think there's pros and cons to that argument. I would say I just came from a place last week where one of the arguments that was being made is that lifetime value is no longer than 12 months. So you can't say you have a 25% subscription base with X amount of dollars per order, and you can extrapolate that out 5 years, and that's a base. You almost have to plan on some kind of switching behavior 12 months out. So how do you maximize that lifetime value over the next 12 months?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people here who are going to want to discuss lifetime value and other key performance indicators over the course of the next couple of days. And guys, thank you for laying out this framework for us. It's fascinating.